Good morning still, I think. Welcome to this inaugural Blytheville Cold War Forum, sponsored by the National Cold War Center. My name is Christian Ostermann. I direct the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program, and I chair the National Advisory Board of the National Cold War Center. I'm delighted to moderate this forum with Professor Jillian Hartley, co-chair of the advisory board and based at Arkansas Northeastern College. The National Cold War Center is located on the campus of the former Blytheville Air Force Base, originally known as the Blytheville Army Airfield, which opened in 1942 as a training facility for World War II pilots, and at the height of the Cold War was converted into a strategic air command alert mission, which remained as a key US military command for 3 decades. The center's mission is to educate and engage visitors in the complex history and global impact of the Cold War, and to deepen understanding of this important phase in American history through immersive experiences on the grounds of this original US Air Force facility. The National Cold War Center has been recognized and officially designated by the state of Arkansas, and last December, the US Congress designated the National Cold War Center as a National Cold War Museum. We anticipate a grand opening of the museum in 2027. The Blytheville Cold War Forum, which will meet every second Wednesday of the month, provides a nonpartisan platform, public platform, for the discussion of Cold War history, memory, and heritage. In particular, the forum seeks to foster informed debate over the public history of the Cold War. Over the past 3.5 decades, academic research on the history of the Cold War has made great strides, benefiting in particular from the release of previously inaccessible archival documentation in the United States, the West, and in the countries of the former communist world and global South. In fact, until the beginning of the Russian war against Ukraine in February 2022, scholars were given access to high-level documentation for the Soviet period in the Russian archives. Libraries of books now constitute this rich, varied, and still developing new Cold War history. By contrast, the public history of the Cold War was initially hampered by, quote, popular indifference and skepticism, as one commentator controversially argued. On the whole, the public history of the Cold War is a more recent effort, though we will hear today from institutions that have been active in this field for a good number of years. Today, the landscape of Cold War museology and commemoration is rapidly developing against the backdrop of diverse memory cultures around the globe, including the United States. In today's session, we will explore how different institutions are exhibiting, displaying aspects of Cold War history. What have been different approaches to exhibiting the Cold War experience, and how do they reflect different understandings of the Cold War? How have museums dealt with the Cold War period in different institutional and cultural contexts? What facets of the Cold War have emerged more prominently in memory culture, and why? And what have been the important silences in exhibits, museums, and other memory sites of the Cold War? To begin addressing these questions, I'm delighted to welcome 4 leading museum leaders and experts in the field. Dr. Douglas Lantry of the National Museum of the US Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. Holger Nehring, Professor Holger Nehring of the University of Stirling in the UK, who in cooperation with the National Museum of Scotland has led a research project on Cold War museum efforts in the UK and continental Europe. Dr. Joe Segal, Chief Curator of the Wende Museum of the Cold War in Culver City, California, and Dr. Elizabeth Spalding, Founding Director of the Victims of Communism Museum in Washington, D.C., and Chair of the Board of the Victims of Communism Foundation. We will proceed as follows. Each of our panelists will give a brief introduction, 10, 15 minutes or so, to their institution or project. I will then give each of the panelists a chance to comment on the other panelists' presentations or address some of the questions, perhaps ask a question, and then invite our audience to join the conversation, evolving around some of the issues I mentioned above. On a technical note, the session will be recorded and published on the National Cold War Center's website. To join the conversation, use the raise hand function on Zoom. Once you do that, you will be put into a queue, and Jillian and I will call on you at the appropriate time to unmute yourself so you can pose your question or comment. You can also post your question or comment to the Q&A function of Zoom, and we will put that question to our panelists. Last but not least, I'd like to thank our colleagues at the National Cold War Center in Blytheville for their support of this event, especially Liz Smith of the Board of Directors and Peter Bierstecker of the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program. Now, let me introduce our speakers, and I'll do so one at a time. I think I'd like Holger to go last. Of the two others, Joas and Elizabeth, do you have a preference of who goes first?
I don't have a preference other than our organization's been around for 30 years. So if that helps.
We can start with you. Let me just ask the team, we're missing Doug Lantry. Can somebody reach out to him and see if we can get him into?
Oh, I'm here.
Oh, you're here. Okay, good. Sorry, could you turn your video on so we can see you?
My video is not operational. I can still share my PowerPoint, but my camera is pointed the wrong way in my office configuration.
All right. Well, we'll work it this way. Why don't we start with Dr. Spalding, then go to Dr. Lantry, and then Dr. Segal, and round it up with Professor Nehring. Is that all right? Good. Then
Sure.
Let me introduce Dr. Spalding. She is, as mentioned, the chairman of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and founding director of the Victims of Communism Museum. She is a senior fellow at Pepperdine University School of Public Policy and a visiting fellow at the Van Andel Graduate School of Government at Hillsdale College. She's the author of The First Cold Warrior, Harry Truman, Containment, and the Remaking of Liberal Internationalism, and the co-author of A Brief History of the Cold War. Her scholarly and popular articles and reviews have been published in a wide array of platforms, including the Journal of Church and State, Orbis, the Wilson Center Quarterly, Providence, the American Spectre, H. Diplo, and the Claremont Review of Books. She teaches and speaks on subjects ranging from presidential leadership, religion and politics, and comparative ideologies to communism, the Cold War, and national security. She's a core faculty member of the VOC's National Seminar for Middle and High School Educators, and she also serves on the board of the Institute on Religion and Democracy. Dr. Spalding holds a PhD and an MA in International Politics and Political Theory from the University of Virginia, and a BA from Hillsdale College. A third-generation anti-communist, she lives with her family in Arlington, Virginia. Elizabeth, the Zoom room is all yours.
Thank you, Christian, and thank you to the National Cold War Center. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm starting in part because the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation is celebrating 30 years old now, and it's an interesting story that might help people who are looking into the topic that we're talking about today. VOC was created by a public law. It was from a unanimous act of Congress, which I know can be very unusual. And part of that was because the members of Congress agreed that an organization in 1993 should be created in order to teach about the victims of communism, and the connection obviously to the Cold War was clear because so many people were forgetting. So various members of Congress said, what's going on? Let's figure this out. And that's how VOC came about as a nonpartisan nonprofit 501c3 signed into law by President Bill Clinton. And our focus for the first half of our existence was on building a national memorial for all the victims of communism on federal parkland. And then we turned more and more to educational programming, including curriculum, and finally to the museum. And you can imagine, as a small nonprofit, part of the challenge is raising money. And part of the reason that the public law was unanimous was that VOC said it would take no government funds. So that's been a challenge for us to jump ahead to one of the things that Christian asked us to comment on. But in terms of the museum itself, we wanted to make a big museum, something obviously inspired by the Holocaust Museum, but related to, as the public law says, that other Holocaust, the one that created victims of communism. And we didn't have the money. So what we have instead is what we call our Jewel Box Museum, and we're on McPherson Square in Washington, D.C., just a couple of blocks from the White House. Our focus and approach is all of the victims of communism. This makes us a unique museum in the world, actually. And you can see right away that you have to understand enough about communism as well as about the Cold War in order to understand why there are victims of communism. So the Cold War and its legacy are intertwined with much of our focus. That approach, that focus, is really one of ultimately anti-communism and being for freedom. So we're both against something that's created victims and for something that we think that all human beings want. This is not to say that the United States is perfect or was perfect in everything that the United States and our side were doing in the Cold War. We are organized around what we call the 3 R's of revolution, repression, and resistance, because at the Victims of Communism Museum, which very much connects to an understanding of the Cold War overall, we really want to make sure that people understand both that human beings are for something as well as resisting against communism throughout. In terms of chronology, history, we cover from the Communist Manifesto to the present, and we are trying to convey big numbers, such as more than 100 million people have been killed by communism since 1917, and also that more than 1.5 billion people still live under communist regimes today. And then also we're trying to convey many personal stories, which we do throughout the museum, including giving people a "you are there" feeling whenever possible. And our goal in our approach is for people to both learn and ultimately to feel, to have some sort of sense of why they should care. So that approach drives everything. We have in our museum 3 permanent galleries that tell that chronology, as well as the history of the victims of communism that I already referenced. We have a big hall for visiting exhibits, which has been tremendous, and I'm happy to answer more questions about that, or answer questions about that. And we also are very fortunate to have an art collection that is unique in the world. It's the Getman collection, and it's 50 pieces of art, of paintings about the Gulag Archipelago. And it's been called the visual analog or counterpart to Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago. In terms of accomplishments, I would say that the main accomplishment thus far with respect to the museum is that we successfully made and opened our museum. And that's, we're coming up on our 2-year anniversary of opening to the public. We've had thousands come through the doors. Of course, we want millions and many more to come through the doors. It's been fascinating to see that people of all walks of life, Americans as well as visitors from other countries, have been coming through, and also all ages have come through, which has been most edifying. Mostly middle school is the youngest, all the way up through retirees. Groups, we've had a lot of groups come through, and maybe we can have some discussion about this in terms of our after all of us have spoken. And then we are an educational nonprofit. So for us, the museum is part of all of our educational programming and events. And it's been wonderful to have a physical space so that we can do that. And so especially for the groups, a school group coming, they can have a talk from a witness, somebody who got away from communism, or a Cold War veteran, or somebody else like that, and then also go through the museum. So it's been a great connection to be able to do that. And then I'd say on the subject of challenges, since Christian also asked us to talk about that, I'd say the main challenge, especially for a small nonprofit, is money, is raising money. And for anybody who's thinking about joining the ranks of museums that connect to the Cold War and communism, or frankly, any museum, that you have to think, and we did, but you have to think about not only the money you need to start your museum, but the money you need to maintain your museum. And that is a big part of it. And then another challenge is, since we are a small nonprofit, getting people to know about us. Although we've been around for 30 years, not everybody knows about the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. And then to be open for going on 2 years is still relatively young. So many people are still finding out about the museum. So getting the word out, raising awareness, all of that is also part of the bundle of challenges that we face. And there's much more I can say, and I look forward to hearing from others in our further conversation. Thank you, Christian.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Fascinating. And I hope that we, with this session today and with future partnerships, contribute to giving the museum greater visibility. Now, let me turn to Dr. Douglas Lantry. He's been a curator at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio since 2000, and he also serves as the museum's historian. His curatorial focus areas include space and missiles, strategic nuclear deterrence, First World War, Korean War, and the war in Southeast Asia. He received his PhD in the history of technology with a certificate in museum studies from the University of Delaware as a fellow in the U.D. Hagley program in the history of American industrialization. He's also a retired U.S. Air Force Reserve historian, serving at headquarters, U.S. Air Force, and U.S. Strategic Command with deployments supporting operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, Kuwait, and Qatar. Doug, the Zoom room is all yours, and I believe you have a short PowerPoint to go along with your presentation.
I do. Can everybody see that PowerPoint? I hope so.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you for the nice introduction, and I look forward to all of the questions and different points of view that this is going to generate. My little slice of the story is from a government military museum perspective, and I'll just spend a couple of minutes talking about that. If I can get my PowerPoint to do what it is supposed to do. Stand by, because I'm having a hard time making this thing. There we go. Okay. So a little bit of background on how the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force interprets the Cold War. We opened the gallery that you see that says 2003 on it there. That is our Cold War gallery. And the little round thing right next to it, which is actually a very big round thing when you get down to the scale of this picture, is our missile gallery. The large building is about 270,000 square feet. And the whole institution, taken as a whole indoors, it's about 20 acres of indoor museum exhibit space. And we're celebrating our 100th anniversary this year, or last year rather. We were founded in 1923, and we have been collecting the material heritage of the United States Air Force and the U.S. Space Force and all of their predecessors ever since then. That's why we need 20 acres of indoor exhibit space in order to show some of that to all of our visitors, we hope. So we've had about 20 years to get busy with this Cold War gallery and the missile gallery. So a little bit about our museum's roles and obligations to begin with. We have to be several things at once because we're responsible to not only the American public, but an awful lot of international visitors. So primarily we have to be a museum, an institution that does all the things that museums do, about introducing people to new or unfamiliar knowledge or facets of knowledge they already have that might offer them a new perspective, new point of view, different things to think about. We also function as a memorial. In other words, we reflect the service of people who come to see us who have served in the Air Force or the Space Force or its predecessors. We are responsible for providing a kind of mirror that validates and describes our veterans' service and sacrifice in ways that they can use to educate their families that they typically bring with them, and in ways that they can use to energize things like reunions and meetings and other memory and community-based events. We're also an attraction. We have to attract people. We have lately begun doing things like proms and all kinds of different meetings, events, and so on. We have had, and I'm not kidding when I tell you, loads and loads of Star Wars characters and people in dinosaur suits and all sorts of things come through here to create a kind of attraction environment. And the idea is that we get a new audience in here for their event or their thing that they're interested in, and then they find out that there is this other topic that they can learn an awful lot about and that has very interesting material culture and very interesting stories to learn. So we combine all those things and act as something of an attraction. We are also, of course, at all times, a government institution. That informs both our point of view, our interpretation, and our ability and our obligation to collect and preserve the material heritage of American air power and all the tangents that that involves. Our collection is enormous. We are the world's largest and oldest military aviation museum. And I would submit that our collection of such things is second to none, especially our research and development collection, which is, I think, unequaled in the world. But above all, point 5 there, you'll see we're an educational institution. Our top priority is to give people takeaway knowledge that they didn't have when they showed up, to enable people to learn something new or have something new to think about that engages knowledge they might already have, encourages conversation, encourages more study, and creates, we hope, an appreciation for our services, heritage, and the contributions of all of the people who have served over the decades in the U.S. Air Force and now the U.S. Space Force. So how does all this work? Like any museum, all the museum professionals out there and my panel colleagues will recognize these things on the left and on the right. The main functions of any museum: to collect, preserve, display, interpret, and study the material heritage of whatever it is their special topic is. It could be quilts, it could be glassware, it could be films, it could be military heritage like ours. But we do all of those 5 things on the left. And what leavens those activities? Well, there are 5 aspects that I call the 5 wickets of museum work. And these things have become clear to me over more than 20, almost 25 years as a government museum curator, time, money, people, facilities, and politics are the wickets through which any museum project must pass in order to either be successful or not in different degrees at different times. All of these things are contingent and iterative, and they all affect one another all the time. So any museum project you do has to pay attention to all of the things on this screen, and any of them can either enhance a project or slow it down or stop it, make it better or worse, or involve new or different people. They all play with one another. And so that is the context that we operate under as a government museum and a representative of the US Department of Defense, and especially the Department of the Air Force. We do those five things on the left on behalf of the American people, and we face the 5 wickets on the right as limiting factors in any project that we undertake. So here's a bird's eye view of what we're up to here. If you look at building number 3, just on the right side of center, you'll see that's our Cold War gallery. And right next to it, the little round shape is the missile gallery. These are very, very large spaces. And our traditional strong suit is the strength of our hardware collection. This is what people traditionally come to see. There is no place that you can see all of these machines of the Cold War and other eras inside in one place, professionally preserved by trained and experienced museum professionals and interpreted for the most part. I'll get to that in a minute. So they're all displayed. Most of them are well interpreted, but we have work to do. Of course, other eras of the Cold War seep into these galleries as well. In building 2, just to the left of center, you'll see the Korean War gallery at the bottom and the Southeast Asia War gallery at the top. These are our hot wars of the Cold War. And so the Cold War as a theme seeps in there. It even seeps in, of course, to the end of the Second World War. And if you're of a really broad interpretive bent, it goes all the way back to Kosciuszko and the end of the First World War, and all the way back to the Finland Station. And all those different themes and places seep into here. It also goes forward into our space gallery on the far right, the research and development gallery, the presidential gallery, of course, and what we call global reach, which involves the Air Force being able to reach all the way around the world to project American policy and influence in a military manner. So that's your bird's eye view walking tour of this place. If you do happen to come see us, please bring comfortable shoes. It's a day-long walk. And you'll want to sit down and have something to eat in the middle of it. I guarantee you're not going to get through this in an hour unless you run, and you will be tired out by the time you're done. So what does the place look like? How do we do this? Well, here is the entrance to our Cold War gallery around 2010. It doesn't look like that now, but you can see what is the emphasis here. It's nuclear danger. That is that has been the main idea that people come here with when they want to ask questions about and learn about the Cold War and the United States Air Force. What about the nuclear world? How was it divided? Who were the players? What did the Air Force do? And in many cases, people are asking the question, they're asking these questions of an older relative who is with them, as in, what did you do? Can you show us? Can you show us the machines? Can you describe what that time was like? Well, we help them do that. Throughout this museum, as I said, hardware is a feature. It is the basis of our collection and the basis of our interpretation of stories. If you are interested in nuclear danger, we have all the weapons. You can come see these, and these are not reproductions. These are real. And in some cases, this can be taken as a whole kind of terrifying. But, taken another way, these are, of course, inert, and they're encased in an interpretive context that is meant to help people understand the passage of time in these geopolitical machinations that the world has been through, and what has their country done in the context of the Cold War. So these things help to illustrate and understand that. We have very, very large machines, and the interstices of these machines are smaller places where personal stories are told. These big machines form a kind of narrative skeleton where smaller things can be inserted about this person's story or that unit's achievements, and how it fit into a bigger whole. Of course, nuclear deterrence includes not only the airplanes that you see, but the only place that you can see all of the missiles on the left in one place anywhere in the world. You'll see if you look closely at that picture, there are space launch vehicles and NASA space launch vehicles in there, human spaceflight vehicles mixed in with the nuclear deterrent. That is because a more recent effort of ours is to tell the public something about the partnership between NASA and the United States Air Force from 1958 to the present and into the future. And so our newest vehicle in there, the Mercury Atlas launch vehicle, which was just installed last week, this is a very new picture, that is used to do double duty, to talk about America's first intercontinental ballistic missile and also the early days of human spaceflight. You can get a more personal human scale view of all this activity by looking at the thing on the right there. 2 missile crew members, one instructing and one learning, in a Minuteman II launch procedures trainer. That also is not a reproduction. That is the real thing. You'll notice that the 2 crew members there are not men. This is a feature of also more recent efforts that we've been undertaking to include the whole force and to explain the emergent and continuing and continually expanding role of all different kinds of demographics within the Air Force to achieve a single mission. And you'll see that in all sorts of places around the museum in increasing numbers. We do tell some standout specific stories. Here's an example, the Cuban crisis, augmented by a U-2A aircraft, which is the correct model, date, and configuration for that brief and very, very scary period in military and American and world history. And we go a little further and not just talk about the airplanes, of course, but talk about the people on the ground who had to make sense of the pictures, the tools they used, how they made conclusions about what they were seeing, and what happened next. So we do tell stories about the tangents to the military service. A more recent effort has been to talk about all the different facets that we can of not just Cold War deterrence, but the scary parts. Developing the bomb, subjecting veterans to nuclear testing, the nuclear nations that have and have not declared nuclear capability. What is doctrine? What is strategy for the lay person who walks in off the street and wants to know, what is this nuclear doctrine you talk about? We explain that. We talk about arms control. We talk about the nuclear triad, the rivalries involved, the political machinations that determine the military policies and define the duties that the different services have to carry out. And so these are newer exhibits. The one thing I don't like about all this is that they're widely separated. It's not one coherent story. These units that you see on the screen are not all in the same place. They're in different places. And I would have that differently, but it didn't work out that way. Remember those Wickets? Not everything works out like you want it to as a museum curator. So we tell these stories, but there are compromises involved. So Christian asked us at the beginning of all this to talk a little bit about achievements and challenges, things that we're proud of and things that we have yet to achieve. And these are simply conversation starters. There's much, much more underneath all this. Our achievements include what I regard as very fine preservation and access efforts. We have preserved the heritage of American air power in a way that no one else has. And we provide access for free. We are open 7 days a week, and there is no charge to walk in the door for anybody. This is all paid for by your taxes, and everybody is welcome in this museum to see and to learn and to ask questions. Our more recent efforts at representing the whole force, in other words, getting away from commissioned officers as pilots flying airplanes as the sole story of the Air Force. It isn't. That isn't the story of the Air Force. It's one story of the Air Force. There are all kinds of people serving in the Air Force doing all kinds of jobs. And so we have highlighted women's roles from women's Air Force service pilots all the way to the present and into the future, Tuskegee Airmen and the inheritors of their legacies, and the contributions of our enlisted force, as well as the commissioned officer force. So our DEI efforts are continuing and expanding to provide a mirror for everybody's service. And we've done a great deal of that, and we continue that. We are very proud to tell some hair-raising and meaningful individual stories. And we're very happy to be on the leading edge of some museum technology, which we can employ in design and exhibitry. Now, the Wickets restrict some of that because with 20 acres under roof, it's very hard to have the highest of high tech in every single exhibit because there's too much stuff and not enough curators. There are only 96 people on staff here, and a small minority of those function as museum curators. Most other people they do the other things that museum professionals do, facilities, operations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You might think, wow, he doesn't have much to complain about. He's got 96 people on staff. But in a place this big, we are all running around with our hair on fire all the time. Trust me, it's true. But that's true of any museum professional. I've never met a relaxed museum professional who doesn't have 15 things to do all the time at once. So same boat as everybody else. Things that we regard as challenges, things we'd like to improve, specific to the Cold War. Our Cold War gallery, despite being open 20 years, does not have an overall narrative or storyline. It is a series of isolated things that may or may not stitch together depending upon how much you know before you get here. Our goal in the future is to have a coherent narrative. We have a plan for this, but decades are required before this can be carried out because it goes slowly with such a big space and a big collection. We treat the Cold War here as a theme. It's the underpinning or the sort of the founding feeling for a lot of things that we tell stories about. It is the basis. It's the kind of nest for the Korean War, the Southeast Asia War, the Cold War Gallery, and much of the space and R&D gallery. But we don't tell it as a coherent story that has a beginning, a motive, a denouement, and even an end. And we're not even sure, I don't think we can agree it's over. It's a new chapter, a new facet, the other side of the coin, however you want to characterize it, something else is starting. And so it's not over, it's just different. And so we will deal with that as the decades go on. And finally, the scale of the work that we have to do versus our resources. I mentioned that there are not too many curators here, and we all have our hands very, very full. I myself have to wear at least 3 hats here as the institutional historian, also as a museum curator, and also for the past 8 months as chief of my division. So all of these things have to happen at once, and somehow I find half an hour to come do this. And so I'm very happy to be able to do this, to share with you all, and to contribute, I hope, to the conversation and to spark some other conversation and maybe questions and answers. And so that concludes a really quick sketch of what we're up to here. I would like all of you out there to come and see us if you haven't. And please let me know you're coming, fellow professionals, so that we can sit and chat and trade stories. So with that, Christian, back to you, and I will stop sharing my screen. I apologize that I don't have any video of me, but my camera just kind of doesn't work that way this week. That's another Air Force challenge. So I'll stop. I think I can stop sharing.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Doug. That was really fantastic, and I appreciate your raising some of the challenges in such a forthright manner as well. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Joas Segal, the Chief Curator and Head of Programming for the Wende Museum of the Cold War. He was previously an assistant professor of cultural history at the Department of History and Art History at the University of Utrecht in Netherlands. He wrote his PhD thesis on German art debates during First World War, and his research focuses on German art history, cultural history of the Cold War, and on visual culture. And that very much, I think, has left an imprint on the way the Wende Museum tells its story. Joas is the author of a wonderful little volume, Art and Politics Between Purity and Propaganda, and co-editor of the collection Divided Dream Worlds, The Cultural Cold War in East and West. Joas, the Zoom is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Christian. I appreciate it, and thank you for inviting me here. Let me also share my screen to start with. And I hope you can see this. This is the entrance of the Wende Museum with a piece of the Berlin Wall, decorated by the artist Thierry Noir, who in the mid-1980s was one of the first to start decorating the Berlin Wall on the west side. We have 11 pieces of the Berlin Wall in total. This one is in front of the entrance of the museum. And then we have a stretch of 10 Berlin Wall pieces along Wilshire Boulevard in Los Angeles, which happens to be the longest stretch outside Berlin. So first of all, a little bit about the museum. It's a collection of art and artifacts and objects from daily life from the socialist countries all over the world during the Cold War period. I think that makes it a bit special in the American context, because most Cold War focused organizations and museums basically focus on the Western world and the United States. We focus on our culture and life behind the Iron Curtain. The museum was founded in 2002, a little bit more than 20 years ago. Started as a private initiative by our current director, Justin Jempel, who was very interested but also concerned about the many objects, materials that were thrown out during that time by people who lived through communism. And yeah, just wanted to get rid of everything that reminded them of their past. He realized that it is important to safeguard those materials for later generations, for historians to have a better understanding of that period. And with that vision, he developed the museum, which, although it started small, is now one of the largest of its kind worldwide. We have around 100,000 unique objects. And also Some very special collections I just mentioned, facial recognition archives from Checkpoint Charlie, the handwritten autobiography from Erich Honecker, the East German leader, wealth of materials from the Polish underground movements, including Solidarność, a large number of Soviet Jewish archives, etc., etc. The main focus of the museum is still safeguarding materials that are in danger of being lost forever and that have the potential of opening up new perspectives about Cold War history. And that is also the philosophy of the curatorial department at the Wende Museum. We want to show surprising aspects. For instance, next to the obvious authoritarianism and suppression, we want to show agency, resilience, creativity behind the Iron Curtain, how people dealt with the political situation and how they were able, sometimes against the odds, to create their own world. I'm going to show you a few quick examples here, just to give you an idea of our approach. This exhibition, from which you see a snapshot here, was called Transformations. And it was actually meant to get people thinking about the meaning and the importance of material culture as a historical source. Since we have so many objects in the museum, we also have a lot of duplicates or almost identical objects. And in this exhibition called Transformations, we place those objects in 4 completely different contexts. So what you see here is the reconstruction of a fantasy living room with garden, where the objects were just shown in their original context as objects for daily use. That then turned into a second installation, which was a flea market, which referenced the phase that these objects were thrown out and considered to be completely worthless. Then the third section was the museum, where the same objects were presented with museum care, curatorial care, to reference the point where they were rediscovered for their aesthetic qualities or their historical significance. And then the last section was an art studio where we invited contemporary artists to work with these objects for projects, installations that comment on their topical relevance. Another example is our exhibition Questionable History, also meant to invite our visitors to reflect more on history. In this exhibition, among other things, we presented artwork not with 1, but with 2 labels. Both of these labels for each work were historically adequate and based on historical research, but in terms of interpretation, they completely contradicted each other. And that provoked the question, what is a historical interpretation? What are the political ideas or political biases behind it? And how can you make sense of it? Another aspect is that in our exhibitions, we try to highlight elements that so far have not been very well addressed. One example here is our exhibition Deconstructing Ideology, which shows art and artifacts from the Cultural Revolution in China. It started, as you can see in the front, with a section on contemporary Chinese art reflecting on the period of Mao and the Cultural Revolution. And then what I think was very interesting about this show was that it not only showed the horrific political system during the years of the Cultural Revolution, but also showed that in spite of everything, there were still people, there were still artists making work that even if it is not immediately clear, managed to present their own vision and to slightly criticize the political system. Another example is our exhibition Vietnam in Transition, where we tried to highlight the Vietnam War and the subsequent cultural and social development of Vietnam through the eyes of Vietnamese artists. So not what you are more used to here, the American perspective from whatever political backgrounds, but the self-critical and nuanced perspective of Vietnamese art on Vietnamese history. Another aspect in this exhibition, we worked together with the state art museums in Dresden in Germany for a large exhibition about women artists in Eastern Europe in the counterculture scene. Counterculture scene has been widely studied, but with a very strong emphasis on male artists, and we tried to show that women artists in that period were actually as interesting and as creative as their male counterparts. We also have a very original collection, I would say, of Soviet hippie materials, something that I think no other museum worldwide has a significant collection of. We worked together with a specialist in the field, Jillian Hartley, who published a book about these materials. And we made the exhibition Socialist Flower Power, also commenting on the parallels, the sometimes surprising parallels between the United States and the Soviet Union in this respect. Another maybe surprising exhibition was our show on David Bowie's travels through the Soviet Union, which I think is something of a surprise, because he is this Western pop icon in a very different context than where you might expect him. He had a great time at the Trans-Siberian Express, and we did a series of programs focusing on his experiences there. Then a collaboration with the Wellcome Collection in London was our exhibition War of Nerves. And I'm now finally going to show you a few examples of exhibitions where we actually consciously try to make an East-West comparison in order to get a better understanding both of the differences and the parallels during the Cold War period. So this exhibition delved into the psychological landscape of the Cold War. Here you see a funny picture of Miss Atomic Bomb. Our current exhibition, called Visions of Transcendence, deals with incarcerated artists in the East and the West. Elizabeth, I heard you speaking about your collection of Gulag paintings. We have some Gulag paintings in this exhibition as well, next to a series of artworks from American and British artists in jail. This is a nice detail of a Soviet sculptor, Leonid Nedov, who made a kind of secret visual diary during his time in the Gulag. And then in this coming fall, we are part of the Getty Foundation funded series PST Art and Science Collide, where we will show our collection of facial recognition materials from Checkpoint Charlie in a global context in East and West, with an exhibition on surveillance and counter-surveillance. And my last example is an exhibition we have planned for next year, Visions of the Cosmos, where we asked the question whether there was such a thing as a communist and a capitalist interpretation of the universe, given the new spectacular discoveries during the Cold War period in terms of cosmology and astrophysics. So with that, thank you very much, and I'll give it back to Christian.
Thank you, Joyce. Fascinating. And if there's time later on, you could also talk a little bit about the program surrounding these exhibits. You've had some fascinating speakers to bring some of these exhibits to life,
right,
in recent months. Now, we've had 3 presentations from people steeped in the midst of building, creating a museum, an exhibit in the United States. We're now turned to a European perspective and more of an academic take on this, I think, with our next speaker, final speaker, Dr. Holger Nehring, who holds a DPhil from Oxford, which he attended with very generous funding from a Rhodes Scholarship before joining the University of Stirling's Division of History and Politics in September 2013. He was based in various positions at the University of Sheffield. He has held a number of visiting fellowships from the Norwegian Nobel Institute all the way to the Mershon Center in Columbus, Ohio, to the Hamburg Institute for Social Research, and so forth. Together with Dr. Sam Alberti at the National Museum of Scotland, he is currently working on a big project on materializing the Cold War, which analyzes museum collections and displays across the UK and Europe. His recent publications include, most relevant here, the article, "The Cold War in European Museums, Filling the Empty Battlefield," published by the International Journal of Heritage Studies in 2022. Holger, it's wonderful to have you with us. Welcome to the Blytheville Forum, and the Zoom room is all yours. We can't hear you.
This is the classic after 5 years or so, still not accustomed. It's great to be here, Christian. Thanks for bringing us together. I really enjoyed the presentation so far, and introducing me to some projects that I haven't been aware of. What I want to do in my talk is, first of all, talking a little bit about our project and how we got to the project, what we want to do in the project, and then talk a little bit about our preliminary findings, which actually map quite well onto what people have already said. We're a whole team of researchers, so there's me, but there's also Sam Alberti and our postdoc Sarah Harper at National Museum Scotland, and then we have a Stirling-based postdoc Jessica Delthwaite. We are also working with 2 or 3 curators at National Museum Scotland who are helping us with an exhibition, and this is all facilitated with very generous funding from the UK's Arts and Humanities Research Council. So what I want to do now is to basically start with an image of the Vulcan bomber, which hopefully is appearing. Here we are. And this is going to basically is the start of the question we've been asking. This Vulcan bomber originally had been designed as a UK nuclear bomber, but by the time it had been developed, it was already obsolescent, which is the sort of UK Cold War technology story, because bombs had become obsolescent, nuclear bombs, as a way to basically do national deterrence. The interesting thing about this bomber is that it wasn't really used in Cold War operations. It was mainly used once in the early 1980s during the Falkland campaign, but it wasn't then used until, again, the early 1990s, very briefly for some kind of air operations in the Iraq War. And then it was retired to this airfield outside Edinburgh, which houses part of the National Museums of Scotland, which is called the National Museum of Scotland Flight, which also has a great collection of mainly airplanes, other things related to aviation. And it's a great place to go to if you ever find yourself there. But what we were basically trying to do is we were trying to find out how we would tell stories and how we would display objects such as this plane in the context of a Cold War exhibition, of a Cold War project. And the interesting thing that we also observed was that in terms of commemoration, the Cold War has not really been present and hasn't really been a driver for heritage activities, at least not in the UK, and also not in most parts of continental Europe. For example, First World War commemorations 20 years, so basically since the 1960s, 70s, 80s in the UK, always led to some kind of new heritage initiatives around, say, war graves, around looking at certain war memorials in the UK. The same is true for the Second World War, but we didn't really see that kind of activity for the Cold War. What we did see was that usually the designation of some kind of national heritage status followed the decommissioning of specific sites that had been used during the Cold War, mostly airfields, some radar stations, some bunkers, but there is a preponderance here of Air Force and airfields as opposed to other parts of the Cold War military history, or indeed any other parts of the Cold War. There were also local initiatives where local people got together, local communities got together, and they built smaller museums around local bunkers, around local civil defense sites, where they then sometimes got government support, sometimes they self-funded this. But the interesting thing is that there was never a sort of general sort of movement of commemoration that led to this. So these were the two issues we were grappling with. And we then got together a team of people from a number of countries, mainly in the UK. First of all, the Imperial War Museums, and at various sites. They also have a site just dealing with aviation, and also the Royal Air Force Museums. They also have various sites, including one which is called the National Cold War Exhibition for the UK. But then also museums across in continental Europe, perhaps most prominently, and we can see this here on the left, the National Aviation Museum of Norway in Bodø, and they have also a U-2 because it was the kind of site of the famous U-2 incidents, or close to the site. So they have a sort of shared history with that event, and they, in a sense, build some of their exhibition around that. But also the Allied Museum in Berlin, which is a sort of private initiative that commemorates and to some extent also celebrates the mainly US presence in the city. And then we also got in touch with a number of other museums in Germany and elsewhere, especially the museum, the German Military Museum in Dresden, which has a fascinating exhibition on post-45 history as well. But what we noticed is, again, when we looked very broadly at those museums, that they don't really tell a Cold War story. So it's pretty much what Doug said was a challenge for his museum. We basically found this almost across the board. So there were lots of exciting objects, lots of stories around those objects, but they usually didn't tell a story about the Cold War through those objects. Sometimes they told a story about the Cold War crises, individual crises, or a collection of crises around certain issues. But there wasn't a sort of overall story that had a sort of clear beginning and an end. So this was the sort of puzzle we were dealing with, and we then did some work on this. And one of the pioneers here was a PhD student Sam and I had at Stirling, who graduated in 2022. And she basically went through the collections of National Museum Scotland to identify what Cold War objects they actually had. And one of the findings was, and this is already quite interesting, is that the museum hadn't actually catalogued any items under a Cold War heading. So there wasn't, when they went into their computer system, into the cataloging system, they couldn't actually easily identify Cold War items. So she actually then went around with the help of various curators to actually map what was there. And this is basically in the title, Bombers, Bunkers, and Badges, because this is pretty much what we found. So there was loads of stuff that was Cold War related, but it hadn't been conceptualized as such. And if you go to the National Museums of Scotland now, also to the aviation side of things, you can find Cold War objects, so produced during the Cold War, used during the Cold War, but they will not be embedded in Cold War stories. And this then got Sam and me to write this article that Christian already kindly mentioned. I put the reference in there, and it's available open access, so you can just download it for free from the publisher, whether or not you have access to that particular journal. So this was basically our puzzle. So first of all, lots of stuff had been produced during the Cold War, both military, infrastructure, roads, electricity pylons, all of that kind of stuff on the military side of things, but also consumer goods. So you could use a Coke can or a Soviet Pepsi bottle or whatever you wish as sort of Cold War objects, but they hadn't been brought together conceptually under that kind of Cold War roof. And then the second thing we found was that maybe that was due to the fact that most of the focus of the Cold War had actually been on the nuclear confrontation, which was deterrence rather than war, and which in effect was a war that never happened. And it was present in terms of war games, but it wasn't present in combat exercises and alerts and things like that. But it wasn't there through real battles where you then have clear heroes around which you can tell stories, and also sometimes clear victims. Although we then need to talk about the questions of, say, victims of communism, or also, for example, the story of armed forces members on whom experiments were conducted, or indigenous communities that were affected by nuclear weapons testing and things like that. But again, those are stories that are more difficult to tell than, say, the story of heroism, of fighting in the trenches, or of some kind of bombing campaign during the Second World War. And so the questions then we asked is, how can we turn the abstract nature of the Cold War and this very abstract story into experiences that we can understand, and how can history help us do that? And we then looked at sort of three things. We looked at, first of all, collections. So what have our museums that we worked with, National Museums of Scotland in particular, what have they collected and what have they done with those collections? Then how is this displayed, or has it been displayed at all? Because what's really important in that context is that most of what museums have is actually in storage sites rather than in the museum. So in National Museums Scotland's case, I think 90 to 90% of stuff that they have is in a storage depot in an Edinburgh suburb, basically in a neighborhood with warehouses. So you pull up there and you find these amazing things inside this warehouse. It's like a library of things, but you can't really go there as a member of the public, although they now have appointments that you can get, and they do some tours through bits of that collection. But most of the stuff is there. So we were looking at the collections, display, secondly, how those decisions are made, what goes into the display, what drives those decisions. And then the third thing is, how do audiences react to that? To the displays, to the exhibitions. What does the audience expect about a Cold War exhibition? And so what have we done so far? What have we found so far? The main output, and this is mainly due to the amazing work of curators at National Museums Scotland with our input is an exhibition on Cold War Scotland that's going to launch in mid-July 2024, where we are basically trying to tell a story about the Cold War in Scotland and what it meant. And our key theme here is the interaction and very often the mixture of feelings of hope and fear. So we are starting with nuclear energy, where we are looking at both the bomb, but then also hopes for the peaceful atom and peaceful uses of nuclear energy, mobilizations around that in terms of social movements. And then we are looking at some of the military mobilizations, both voluntarily, but also then soldiers. And we are looking at some connections. So Scotland with US Navy soldiers who were stationed there as part of the submarine contingent in Holy Loch, and then also looking to the other side, interactions with the Soviet Union. So we're trying to sort of tell some kind of more holistic story in this exhibition, and we need to see how that works because it's not there yet. It's going to be a rather small exhibition, but it basically contains some of the objects that you can see here, including specific ties. So with tartans. So one of the US submariners actually had a tartan made in commemoration of his time in Scotland, and which has kind of been authorized by the relevant authorities that do these kinds of things. So there is actually, for example, a Polaris tartan as well, and there are also others. The other things are still rather preliminary, and you can see here a sort of blast map of the area around Edinburgh. This was the assuming a Soviet attack and then what would happen in terms of the radiation. So preliminary findings are that, first of all, the Cold War is actually, when you dig down and when you look at some of the objects and some of the stories that attach to those objects, not that abstract. And it actually is very closely linked to some of the experience, especially if we look at the early phase, to the Second World War, especially if we look at infrastructure. So Blytheville, it might be a very good example for this, because we can see here the transition from a Second World War airbase to a new function in the Cold War. And we found that this was very often the case in Scotland, that things were repurposed. So I think this is something that one could do more work with. The second thing we've been trying to do is to promote the Cold War as a category of collection and of analysis with museums. So to raise awareness for museums to actually look at their collections and to sort of highlight Cold War elements of their already existing collections and exhibition. Then another thing we've done is we've engaged with some amateur groups, especially around, for example, the Royal Observer Corps. That was a sort of civil defense organization. And they've been very active in both collecting material pertaining to their time. They're sometimes veterans, now in their sort of 70s and 80s, but still very active in terms of collecting and creating sort of mini museums at some of the bunker sites, for example. And we've been trying to work with them but in actually two ways, because they've given us some of their amazing insights into what these objects mean, how they've been used, but we've been trying to contextualize that a bit. And then the question we've really been grappling with is the global nature of the Cold War. And that's something that we actually haven't found a solution to at all, because most of the collections of the museums we've worked with are very Europe-based or very sort of transatlantic-based. And there's hardly anything that can be used to show some of the components of the Cold War that happened outside that European, North American, transatlantic space, the sort of proxy wars around the world, which were actually not cold at all, but which were very hot. So Paul Chamberlain has called these the killing fields of the Cold War, or Cold War Killing Fields is the name of his book. And there's very little in the museums we've worked with that can be used to illustrate that and to connect that to this other story that is more about deterrence and about that kind of interaction between fear and hope. And I think that's going to be, this is going to be a really exciting challenge to address and to see how can we kind of bring the global nature of the Cold War in. The other thing we've noticed, and that's my conclusion. That's my conclusion, is that we've noticed a real uptick in interest in the Cold War since Russia's attack on Ukraine. And this basically shows that heritage is always about the present and the future and what we do with it, rather than just about the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Holger. That was brilliant. And you can't plan these conversations and sessions all the way through ahead of time, but I think these 4 presentations really complemented each other very well. And I'm struck, that they're very different approaches here to the subject, based in part on, I think, very different understandings of what the Cold War was. So I think there's a lot of food for thought here, certainly food for thought for us at the National Cold War Center as we're thinking about our exhibit. I'm struck that, a part of the issue of doing it comprehensively will have to be resolved by us, all of us, working closely together and connecting and sending our visitors to each other, because we all cover important aspects of the Cold War, be it the geopolitics, the nuclear arms race side, the nuclear threat side of things, but also the communism and anti-communism, freedom versus dictatorship, the ideological side of the Cold War. Both are important, relevant aspects of the Cold War. For any folks in the audience, if you have a question, let me know. We will pose those to our panelists. But since we are quickly running out of time after these fascinating presentations, let me see if I can ask you to respond to what I see as a central challenge for all of us, and that is to convey the experience of living in the Cold War, which to new generations seems like ancient history. And I wonder, based on your work, what strategies do you employ to connect with visitor, to provide that visitor experience that connects, and especially vis-a-vis next generations? Anybody like to respond to that? I'd love to hear from as many of you as possible.
Yes, I'd be happy to start. The human element is so very important. The history has to always be there. The history accurately has to be there. But if all of us have talked about the necessity of personal stories, and if you don't have those personal stories, then you can't build the overall coherent arc. And what we've been able to do at the Victims of Communism Museum, because everything is connected to that, is you do actually get a coherent story about the Cold War connected to the history of communism, because the focus is on those victims of communism over and over again. So we have one main theme, but that human element is so very important. So we have in our 3rd permanent gallery, we have interactives. And so anybody can try out being, the storylines are from the former East Germany, from North Korea, and from Cuba. And so somebody starts having to make the choices that you would have to make living in those particular countries at the particular times highlighted. And only at the end do they realize that a lot of the impossible really choices that they were asked to make were made by a real person. And then there's a reveal at the end. Hey, you've just gone through the life of so-and-so. So I think that kind of thing is important to do, to bring alive this for the rising generations, because you are so right that it's ancient history. It's ancient history to people who lived through parts of it even. But especially for the rising generations, they need to learn the history, but also have enough of an immersive quality where they're learning and then, like I said earlier, feeling, we hope, in some way as well.
Thank you. Yes. Anyone else?
Yeah, may I?
Yeah, Joyce, please. Yes.
follow up? Yes, so I completely agree with Elizabeth that personal stories are so important to bring across the real experiences of that time. And our strategy to make it work for a younger generation is to combine it and compare it with present day experiences. For instance, we invited a group of Culver City High School students to make artwork inspired by the collection, where they reflect on the historical experiences as presented at the Wende Museum, and then respond with their own daily life experiences that sometimes produce a very interesting parallel. And one other example is that we recently had a pop-up exhibition of Nadia Tolokonikova, who is the founder of Pussy Riot. And she is also part of our exhibition of incarcerated artists, and she was incarcerated under Putin. So it shows the continuity of history and the relevance of those structures throughout time.
Yes.
Thank you. Holger and Doug, I can't see you, so I don't know if you'd like to say anything.
Sure. I think I would like to echo all of that. The personal combined with the broad brush of the political and the geopolitical is absolutely necessary, as I think we all agree, for understanding what the Cold War was about and how it made individuals feel and act and interact and so on. And to an extent, we depend at the National Museum of the United States Air Force on collaboration between people who lived the experience and younger generations. We tell stories, we pose questions, we present interesting things to look at, film, sound, movement, color, and so on. But the people who bring younger people to the museum and can explain that I did this, this was my job, this is why we did it, this is what it felt like to be there to do that, that is crucial. So it's an intergenerational collaboration that we depend on. We feel that we're effective at telling stories and setting scenes, but there is no substitute for the human voice, the human in-person interaction of someone saying, I was there, I felt it, I did it, and this is why it was scary, and this is why you should care about it. So we depend on the human and the static of the museum environment.
Thank you. Olga, anything to add on?
Yeah, that's that.
Briefly,
I agree with all of the above. I just want to sort of, as a counterpoint, what was interesting when we started planning this, in light of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, there was one member of staff who actually expressed concerns about our exhibition because their family had come from the Eastern Bloc. And they then found that this was hugely offensive to run an exhibition during this kind of time period. And it's really interesting because we hadn't foreseen this at all, but it actually shows how it shows this kind of relationship between the geopolitical situation, what one can do in an exhibition, and then personal experiences quite well. And this was someone without direct experiences of Eastern Europe themselves. So this was no one who had sort of experienced communist oppression, but this had been, in a sense, bequeathed to them through generations of family histories. And this is kind of really important, and I think shows the importance of this kind of trying to look at stories, personal reminiscences, and expertise as well.
Thank you. So very interesting. I'm afraid we will have to bring this discussion to an end. We clearly could go on for quite some time exploring some of these various aspects. There are a number of things that struck me, including the role of art in several of these undertakings. Also, getting across that human experience. Lots of other aspects. We will continue this conversation. We, as I mentioned, planning to have these meetings on the Blytheville Forum on a monthly basis. And in future sessions, we'll also hear from European museum makers and leaders and from elsewhere around the world. For today, I have to thank our panelists, Elizabeth Spalding, Joe Segal, Holger Nehring, Doug Lantry, and Jillian Hartley for joining us, for taking the time to begin this conversation. My thanks to the National Cold War Center colleagues, Liz Smith, and also my colleague at the Wilson Center, Peter Bierstecker, for helping us with some initial technical difficulties. In the end, it all worked out. I'm so grateful. We're adjourned. Thank you and take care.